It was just after 10 a.m. when a sleek black Lincoln Continental eased into the rest area off I-94, its engine purring with quiet confidence. Behind the wheel sat Raymond Carter, dressed immaculately in a slate gray suit and light blue dress. Shirt, the very picture of a high-powered executive on a mission. In the passenger seat rested a slim leather portfolio containing critical documents for a governor's policy roundtable scheduled at noon. To any passerby, he looked like an ambitious CEO preparing for a boardroom showdown, not a man who would soon find himself cuffed by overzealous state troopers. Yet within moments the hum of his engine was drowned out by the sharp staccato of sirens, and two flashing blue lights pulled behind him, transforming a routine pit stop into a harrowing crucible of suspicion and raw prejudice. This is where our story begins, a story that will flip the script on power, privilege, and what happens when the man in the suit is far more than he appears to be. From the moment Officer Jeffers stepped out of his cruiser, hand hovering near his holstered weapon, the air crackled with unspoken assumptions. In Jeffers's eyes, a solitary black man in a luxury car at a highway rest stop was enough to warrant immediate distrust. His partner, Officer Reic, arrived seconds later, her expression a mix of uncertainty and deference to Jeffers's authority. Raymond lowered his window slowly and kept both hands visible on the steering wheel as he offered a calm, respectful greeting. Not a word of aggression, not a hint of defiance, only measured politeness. But that veneer of civility meant nothing in the face of a presumption of guilt. One clipped accusation of a stolen vehicle, a brusque order to exit the car, and Raymond's world shifted from orderly predictability to humiliating chaos. Imagine the shock of being treated like a suspect when you've spent 2 decades serving justice from the bench. Imagine the sting of being reduced in the blink of an eye to a stereotype, stripped of your title, your experience, your dignity. As onlookers recorded the scene on their phones and whispered judgments, Raymond Carter stood tall, hands cuffed behind his back, head held high. He was calm, collected, but inside he was watching, calculating, preparing for the moment when roles would reverse. Because this was not the last chapter, it was the prelude to a reckoning. The very next day, the man these officers presumed beneath them would take his seat at the head of a hearing to evaluate their conduct, wielding the gavel they never thought he deserved. In this introduction, we invite you to step into that charged moment at the rest stop, to feel the tightening knot of tension in your chest as the flashing lights draw near, and to sense the quiet resolve beneath Raymond's composed exterior. You'll witness how a single, seemingly ordinary traffic stop can expose the enduring stains of racial bias and ignite a catalyst for systemic change. By the end of this narrative, you won't just see a judge in handcuffs. You'll see a leader who turned an act of injustice into a powerful turning point, a man who traded the confines of a patrol car for the authority of a courtroom, and a quiet hero whose dignity became a rallying cry for countless others. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of this Undercover CEO saga, revealing how one person's unshakable integrity can shatter assumptions, redirect the course of power, and redefine what it means to serve and be served by justice. The sun had barely climbed above the highway overpass when Raymond Carter guided his Lincoln Continental into the rest stop bay, its glossy black finish glinting in the morning light. He parked beneath the low-slung canopy, the engine's purr fading into the distant roar of trucks on I-94. Clad in a slate gray suit with a light blue shirt and matching tie, he looked every bit the seasoned executive heading to a critical boardroom session, except his portfolio contained not quarterly financials but policy briefs for a governor's justice reform roundtable scheduled at noon. In that quiet lull, he believed himself beyond reproach, an unassuming judge pausing for coffee and fuel before the day's high-stakes negotiations. No sooner had he shut off the engine than blue strobe lights carved jagged patterns across his windshield. Officer Jeffers' cruiser rolled in behind him with a gravitas that brooked no argument. Almost simultaneously, Officer Reic's vehicle slipped to a stop at an angle that boxed him in. Raymond's calm morning ritual was interrupted by the rapid click of police boots on asphalt. Peering through tinted glass, he registered 2 uniformed figures converging on his driver's side window. In that slow-motion instant, the world shifted. Boss instincts kicked in first. Disarm with courtesy. He lowered his window, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "Good morning, officers. Is there a problem?" His tone was practiced, measured, but polite. Jeffers, towering and taut, peered in with narrowed eyes, the brim of his hat casting a dark shadow over his face. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching your description," he said, voice clipped. "Step out of the car." There was no please, no sir, only a command. Raymond's polite confusion rippled through him like an electric shock. "A stolen vehicle?" he asked, brow furrowing. "I haven't heard any such report. If you like, I can show you my registration and proof of ownership." Jeffers' reply came without a flicker of courtesy. One sharp step backward, his hand drifting toward the holster on his hip. "Out. Now." The subtext was clear. Your civility won't save you. With deliberate calm, Raymond opened the door and hoisted himself out, hands raised at shoulder height. His suit jacket caught on the doorframe, then slipped free, a silent symbol of his exposed vulnerability. In his gentle voice, an echo of decades spent soothing tense courtrooms, he asked, "Officer, may I know what grounds you have for detaining me?" Jeffers ignored the question, seizing Raymond's arm and twisting it behind his back. The metal cuffs slammed shut around his wrists, biting into flesh and leaving angry red impressions. Raymond winced but refused to resist, his spine straight even as humiliation flooded him. Jeffers' partner, Reic, hovered uncertainly, eyes darting between her colleague's assertive grip and Raymond's calm submission. She said nothing at first, then moved to secure the other cuff. In that space between accusation and arrest, a fragile tension cocooned them all. The certainty of authority on one side, the quiet dignity of a wrongfully accused man on the other. Led to the rear of the cruiser, Raymond's crisp shoes scuffed the pavement. The hard plastic seat inside the squad car offered no comfort, only a stark contrast to the plush leather of his Continental. He lowered himself with the same composed posture he'd display at the policy table. No flinch, no flop, just measured, grace under pressure. As the door thudded shut, he was left in near darkness, save for the sliver of light from the grill. Outside, a handful of travelers froze in their tracks. A college student lounging near the snack machines raised her cell, phone the red record light flickering. "This is insane," she whispered, zooming in on a silent confrontation she sensed was wrong. Nearby, a retired veteran in a faded baseball cap shook his head. "That man doesn't look like someone who stole anything," he muttered, voice low but clear. They belonged to a silent chorus of witnesses, observers caught between empathy and helplessness. Their recorded testimonies would matter later, though not in this moment. Inside the cruiser's rear, Raymond stared out through the barred window, past the gas pumps, past the empty coffee cups abandoned by startled customers. His mind raced, through scenarios, the officer's suspicion born not of evidence but of skin color and vehicle value, the swift abandonment of protocol, the cruel irony of a judge being judged on his appearance. Yet outwardly his expression remained unreadable, masking the burning humiliation, the simmering indignation, and the ember of resolve lighting deep within him. After several minutes that felt like hours, the back door opened, and a different uniformed voice barked, "Move." They uncuffed his left wrist, though the red welts remained. He stepped out onto the asphalt, raw sunlight hitting him like a spotlight. He was guided into the precinct, a building that reeked of stale coffee and recycled air. Inside the booking area, he was ushered into a hard plastic chair. No apologies, no questions. Just another suspect, another form to fill out, another tick in the system's box. The booking officer glanced at his ID but didn't look closer than the first line. The routine entry clacked on the keyboard, reducing Raymond Carter, 20-year judge, policy architect, to a mere entry in a logbook. For nearly 2 hours he sat in silence. He asked 3 separate times to call his office, explaining his policy round-table appointment. Each request was ignored or brushed aside. Typing and chatter filled the precinct, keyboards clicking, radios crackling, footsteps shuffling. Jeffers patrolled nearby, glancing in with thinly veiled irritation. Reic lingered farther back, arms folded, her gaze averted. The officers exchanged smirks as they passed, making him ever more aware of their presumption that his calm equated to guilt. Meanwhile, the public witnesses filtered inside for coffee refills or quick restroom visits. Some paused at the sight of the lone figure in a chair, head tilting as if recognizing the absurdity of it all. A college student hovered by the door, phone in hand, debating whether to record more. A veteran approached the counter, his eyes flicking back to Raymond before he turned away. The unspoken judgments of bystanders, some sympathetic, some indifferent, wove through the air, a tapestry of public scrutiny and private conscience. This was the crux of it. Raymond Carter, a man defined by justice, was being deprived of every right he had upheld for decades. His title meant nothing on this linoleum floor, yet his unshakable calm transformed the indignity into something far more powerful, a silent protest against the very system that had abused him. And as each mocking word from Jeffers, about people like you always having an excuse, floated, across the room Raymond didn't snap or shout. He merely listened, absorbing every slight, every biased barb, committing them to memory like evidence for a case he intended to win. By the time Sergeant Pamela Yates made her entrance, the air was thick with anticipation, though nobody could articulate why. Raymond's hands bore fresh red marks. His suit bore the dust of the asphalt. His soul carried the weight of 1,000 injustices he'd witnessed but never endured. All the while, he sat with his back straight, eyes unflinching, aura unwavering. Some might have mistaken his silence for guilt. In reality, he was waiting. For truth, for vindication, for the moment when power would shift back to its rightful owner. In that charged atmosphere, an overheated room echoing with prejudice, one question loomed over every onlooker's mind. Who exactly was this dignified detainee? And what force within him would turn this moment of degradation into a reckoning far greater than any policy roundtable could muster? In mere moments the answer would arrive, flipping the narrative and proving that dignity, once tested, can emerge not broken, but unbreakable. Sergeant Pamela Yates swept into the holding area like a judge entering a courtroom, purposeful, observant, her gray hair pinned in a precise bun that bespoke both authority and attention to detail. Her polished boots clicked against the linoleum floor as she paused at the threshold, gaze flicking over the lone figure seated in the plastic chair. Raymond Carter's head was high, his shoulders squared, though the red welts around his wrists told a tale of indignity. His suit, once crisp, bore faint scuffs from the asphalt. His tie was slightly askew. Yet there was something about his stillness that drew Yates's eyes again and again, a quiet confidence that cut through the din of whispered conversations and keyboard clicks. "Who's been holding this, gentleman?" she asked, voice clear but not unkind. Her question hung in the air, met only by the rustle of papers from the booking desk. Officer Jeffers, who had been hovering nearby, straightened his posture. "Obstruction of an investigation, ma'am," he said, tone clipped. "Vehicle match, refusal to consent, interference." He gestured dismissively at Raymond as if summing up a trivial bureaucratic inconvenience. Officer Reic stood a few paces back, arms tucked behind her, face pinched with uncertainty. Yates nodded slowly, absorbing the summary. Something in her eyes shifted. Perhaps it was the way Raymond met her gaze with unflinching calm, or the faint sheen of dust on his polished shoes that hinted at his account of how he'd been treated. She tapped the name on the manila folder in her hand. Raymond Carter. But the last name was enough to spark a glimmer of skepticism. She set the folder on the counter and moved to the terminal. As the screen flickered to life, she typed, "In the details, date of birth, driver's license number, state ID." The green cursor blinked at her, waiting. Moments later, the system populated with a record that stretched far beyond a typical criminal history check. Yates's brow creased as she scrolled. Academic honors, miles of judicial appointments, legal certifications, and at the very top, bold text, Raymond L. Carter, presiding judge, 14th District Court, State of Michigan. The photo was a direct match to the man before her. Same steady eyes, same lowered chin. Her breath caught, and she blinked as reality settled in. The gravelly hum of the precinct seemed to fade, and even the fluorescent lights above lost their harsh glare. "Officer Jeffers," Yates said, her voice controlled but colder than before. He froze mid-step, posture rigid as a statue. "Would you come here, please?" Jeffers approached, confusion flickering across his face. "Yes, Sergeant." His voice carried the smug assurance of a man convinced of his rightness. Yates pointed to the terminal. "Explain this." She let the image linger, the name hovering on the screen. "This man is Presiding Judge Raymond Carter." Jeffers's eyes widened and his jaw slackened as the weight of her words sank, and as the smugness drained from his expression, leaving behind a pale flush of shame. "But ma'am, The words died on his lips. Officer Reic swallowed and shifted her gaze to the floor. In that charged moment, the power dynamic that had dominated the last 2 hours dissolved. Stepping closer, Yates folded her arms. "You arrested a sitting state judge without probable cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant. You denied him the right to contact counsel." Each violation rolled off her tongue like a verdict. "Do you understand what that means?" Her eyes locked on Jeffers's, piercing through the haze of his previous confidence. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, words failing him. Reic's cheeks burned as she nodded slowly, unable to muster a response beyond a reluctant, "Yes, Sergeant." Raymond Carter rose from the plastic chair, every inch the dignified jurist he had been for decades. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "Sergeant Yates, I appreciate your prompt attention to this matter," he said. "I would like to contact the governor's office now and then proceed to my scheduled event." Yates studied him for a beat, as though calibrating her reaction. Then she offered the first genuine apology of the morning. "Your Honor, I am deeply sorry. This should never have happened." She turned toward the booking officer. "Remove these cuffs immediately, escort him to the front entrance, and call his office as requested, and make sure to document an internal review of these events." Jeffers and Reic watched in stunned silence as Yates guided Carter out of the holding area. Their earlier bravado had wilted under the weight of her rebuke and the judge's composed authority. Carter walked with slow dignity, the scars of injustice still fresh on his wrists but overshadowed by the unwavering poise in his stride. When he reached the exit, he paused and turned to face the precinct officers assembled behind glass. For a moment he stood framed by the bright light of the corridor, judge's robes invisible beneath his suit but their gravitas unmistakable. Outside, a gathering of travelers and staff ducked out of the break room, drawn by the unusual procession. A college student who had recorded the entire ordeal held up her phone, live streaming as Carter walked past. "This is Judge Carter," her caption read, "walking out of custody after being falsely arrested." Within seconds, the footage pinged across social platforms, igniting fresh waves of outrage and solidarity. Hashtags like "Dark Justice for Carter" and "Dark Judge in Cuffs" began trending again as viewers shared the live clip. Inside, Sergeant Yates returned to her desk, the terminal still displaying the judge's credentials. She exhaled slowly, then picked up her phone to file her report, her gray eyes steely with purpose. In the precinct's buzz, now tinged with shame and a new, uncertain respect, the air seemed to hum with the promise of accountability. By midday, the first news alerts hit the governor's communications team. Judge Carter released after wrongful arrest. State police suspend officers after judicial misidentification. Viral video fuels call for police reform. Screens in Yao. Conference rooms flickered with headlines while aides debated talking points. The viral storm that had started at a lonely rest stop was now a full-blown call to action. As the precinct door locked behind him, Carter raised his phone and dialed the governor's office himself. His voice was measured but calm as he made arrangements for transportation to the policy roundtable. A small smile touched his lips, a recognition that the moment of reveal had been swift and decisive. But the real work was just beginning. He knew that a judge's role extended beyond presiding over cases. It was, in this instant, about setting a new standard for justice. In precincts and courthouses across the state, officers watched the unfolding drama on their monitors, some with clenched jaws, others with nods of grim approval. Citizens who had only moments ago felt powerless at the sight of uniformed authority now saw a glimmer of hope. That power could be held to account, and that dignity, once tested, could not easily be broken. And so, as Raymond Carter climbed into the unmarked vehicle waiting to whisk him back to the Capitol, the atmosphere crackled with possibility. The viral video of a judge in handcuffs had become more than a momentary outrage. It was a turning point, a revelation that even the highest seat of justice could be vulnerable to bias, and therefore all the more essential to protect. What would come next? How would Carter wield this moment of reversal to drive systemic change? Could the shock of his arrest and the public's reaction translate into lasting reform? Those questions lingered in the air as the car pulled away, leaving behind a precinct transformed by shame and resolve, and a viral storm that promised to reshape the very fabric of law enforcement. The stage was set for the next chapter, one where a judge would not only oversee policy, but embody the power of accountability, turning a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for justice reform across the state. By the time the sun peeked through the stained glass of the state capitol, the story of Judge Raymond Carter had already become the defining narrative of the week. Outside the Grand Rotunda, where polished marble floors reflected Corinthian columns, overhead, reporters clustered like flocks of sparrows fighting for the best vantage point. Lenses clicked, microphones crackled, and the low hum of satellite trucks formed a living soundtrack to a moment charged with both outrage and possibility. The usually hushed, almost reverential air inside the Capitol had been replaced by a brittle tension. Cameras trained on oak-paneled doors marked Room 312, where at exactly 10 a.m. a justice reform roundtable was set to begin. Even the acrid scent of fresh coffee and inked notepads seemed infused with urgency. No one dared waste a drop or a word. At precisely 9:59 a.m., the doors swung open and Judge Raymond Carter entered with the same unflappable poise he'd displayed on that fateful morning at the rest stop. Clad in a charcoal blue suit that complemented his steady demeanor, he carried only his slim leather portfolio and the weight of yesterday's indignity, now transformed into a potent symbol of resilience. Reporters swooped in, scribbling his name in shorthand, catching his nod of acknowledgement, and marveling at the calm strength he radiated. As he took his place at the head of a long mahogany table, the usual chatter of policy wonks and law enforcement advisors fell away, replaced by a solemn hush. Even the governor, seated just across from him, leaned forward with keen attention, as if to absorb every inflection of his voice. When Carter finally spoke, his words were measured, but bore the force of someone who had stared into injustice and refused to blink. Yesterday, he began, voice low yet unyielding, I was detained and handcuffed by 2 state troopers on the ground of suspicion alone. There was no warrant, no probable cause, only a profile based on my appearance. His gaze swept the room, landing on familiar figures in crisp uniforms, suited bureaucrats and civil rights advocates alike. This video, he said, nodding toward a paused clip on a nearby monitor, speaks for itself. This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic failure. In that instant, a gathering intended for technical discussion on training standards morphed into an existential reckoning on the very nature of accountability. As aides hastily adjusted the agenda, scribbling emergency misconduct hearing across meeting minutes, Carter remained at the forefront. The governor's legal counsel stammered through an apology before asking Carter if he would preside over the hearing. After confirming there was no conflict of interest, Carter agreed. The room breathed a collective sigh. The power dynamic had flipped. The man once stripped of his dignity would now reclaim it in the full glare of public scrutiny, not as a passive victim, but as a judge overseeing the officers who had arrested him. Within minutes, the panel was convened. The courtroom atmosphere settled like dust in golden sunlight filtering through tall windows. Carter sat at the center bench, flanked by 2 fellow judges and the state attorney general. On the opposing side, Officers Jeffers and Reic took their seats, Jeffers with a stiff jaw and Reic with eyes downcast. The hush deepened as Carter called the hearing to order. "We are not here to relive public embarrassment," he intoned, "but to evaluate conduct and determine whether the actions taken violated legal standards and human decency." His words, calm yet authoritative, set the tone for a proceeding that transcended any routine internal review. As video evidence played, every frame of the rest stop arrest replayed in stark relief. Jeffrey's clipped commands, the unsanctioned search, the twisting of handcuffs, all unfolded again under Carter's watchful eye. When Jeffers took the stand, Carter's questions were precise and unwavering. "Did you verify my identity before handcuffing me? Did you have a warrant to search my vehicle? Did you permit me to contact legal counsel as required by protocol?" Each question landed like a gavel, forcing the officer to confront procedural failures and personal bias. Reic's testimony fared no better. Under cross-examination, she admitted she had deferred to Jeffers without verifying any facts. Every admission chipped away at the veneer of following orders, exposing a pattern of negligence rooted in presumption. After hours of meticulous review, testimony, body camera clips, witness statements, the panel retired to deliberate. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Staff whispered in corners about the landmark nature of the hearing. A sitting judge presiding over the discipline of those who had arrested him. 20 minutes later, the judges returned. The room stilled as Carter read the verdict. Officers Jeffers and Reic were found negligent in violation of protocol and guilty of infringing upon constitutional rights. The recommended discipline: suspension without pay pending a full investigation by the Attorney General's office. Flashbulbs popped as Carter concluded, "This ruling reflects a misuse of authority grounded in personal bias and a dangerous lapse in professional judgment." That afternoon, the governor held a press conference in the rotunda. Standing beside her, Judge Carter listened as she announced a package of reforms: mandatory statewide racial bias awareness and de-escalation training for all law enforcement personnel, the creation of an independent oversight commission, and funding for free legal clinics to assist those who'd been wrongfully detained. When reporters pressed him for comment, Carter stepped forward. "What happened to me," he said, voice resonant, "can happen to any innocent person without a title or camera watching. This is not just my story. It's a symptom of a deeper wound in our system. But wounds can heal with sunlight, truth, and accountability." His words rippled beyond that chamber, carried by broadcast signals and social media shares into living rooms across the state. In the days that followed, community organizations sprang into action. Town halls convened in church basements and school auditoriums. Residents shared stories of mistaken arrests and profiling. Legal nonprofits established pro bono hotlines and mobile clinics, staffed by volunteers inspired by Carter's resilience. On social platforms, montage videos of Carter's composed dignity and unwavering resolve sparked hashtags that trended nationwide. Dignity under duress, or justice rising, or Carter effect. His image, suit slightly rumpled, wrists marked by handcuffs, gaze steady, became a touchstone for accountability and hope. Back at the courthouse, life resumed its rhythm, but the atmosphere had shifted. Attorneys paused at security checkpoints to nod at Carter, offering quiet congratulations. Defendants rose with newfound respect, recognizing that beneath the bench sat someone who had lived their fears and channeled them into reform. And above it all, on a bulletin board near the clerk's office, a single newspaper clipping remained pinned: Carter addressing the first class at the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy under the state's new bias awareness curriculum. That image, Carter, at a podium of polished wood, flanked by graduated cadets in crisp uniforms, offered a promise that this story was far from over. It was a bridge to a future where justice would not be an abstract ideal, but a lived reality, shaped by those who had endured its absence and emerged determined to rebuild it. As the cadets listened to Carter's closing words, "You're not just here to enforce laws. You're here to protect dignity, one interaction at a time. The legacy of his trial by bias began to unfold in the next generation of law enforcement, from viral outrage to marble halls, from victim to judge, and from headline to policy. Raymond Carter's ordeal had become a catalyst for systemic change, yet he understood that true reform would not be measured in press releases or evening newscasts, but in the quiet moments. A sergeant pausing before drawing her weapon, a cadet hesitating to profile a suspect, an ordinary citizen finding their voice in a town hall meeting. In those individual choices, the true power of this story would take root, one act of accountability at a time, building a foundation of fairness that could outlast any viral clip or political cycle. It was a bright spring afternoon when Judge Raymond Carter arrived at the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy, not as a defendant, but as a mentor. 52 cadets stood at rigid attention on the wide stone parade ground, their crisp uniforms reflecting sunlight as flags above them snapped in a gentle breeze. No media cameras cluttered the scene, only the fluttering banners and the quiet focus of young recruits who represented the next generation of officers. Carter stepped onto the raised dais with measured confidence, the same steady poise that had carried him from handcuffed detainee to courtroom presider. For a moment, time seemed to pause, as if the world recognized the irony of the moment. The man once profiled and arrested, now entrusted with shaping the hearts and minds of those charged with our safety. Clearing his throat, Carter surveyed the lined-up recruits and began with a soft but resonant tone. 3 months ago, he said, I stood on the other side of a badge. I was treated not as a judge, not even as a person, but as a threat, simply because someone guessed I might be dangerous. His voice held neither bitterness nor bravado, only purpose. He paused, allowing the weight of those words to sink in. Then, leaning slightly forward, he issued his core charge. You're not here to enforce laws alone. You're here to protect dignity. See every person in front of you not as a statistic or a suspect, but as someone's father, sister, neighbor, or friend. A hush fell over the formation. The recruit's eyes sharpened, absorbing his message with the gravity it deserved. Carter's face, lined by experience rather than age, conveyed both the scars of injustice and the quiet triumph of resilience. In that moment, the echoes of a threat had faded completely. In their place stood a figure of moral authority, guiding future officers toward a culture of respect and empathy. He continued, weaving in lessons from his own ordeal, the importance of pausing before drawing conclusions, the responsibility that comes with the power to detain, and the life-altering impact of a single misjudged glance. Justice, he reminded them, is not carved in stone above the courthouse door. It lives in each choice you make when no one is watching. His words struck a chord, transforming abstract policy discussions into visceral, personal commitments for those young men and women. As he closed his speech, Carter stepped back and surveyed the recruits one last time. I chose to stand still and speak calmly when I was wrongly accused. It wasn't weakness, it was strength. And you can show that same strength every day, with every encounter. He nodded and descended the dais, leaving behind cadets who stood a little straighter, their expressions more thoughtful than proud. After the ceremony, a young black recruit approached and placed a firm hand on Carter's shoulder. Thank you, sir, he said quietly. The judge offered a small, genuine smile. Go serve with honor, Carter replied, and watched the recruit join his peers in filing off the parade ground. This full-circle moment at the academy wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. Carter understood that systemic change unfolds not in grand gestures but in countless individual acts of integrity and empathy. As he walked away from the podium, no cameras in sight, he allowed himself a brief reflection on the journey from rest-stop handcuffs to this spring afternoon's promise of reform. What comes next? In our next episode, we'll track the early results of these training reforms, follow up on real-world cases where bias awareness made a difference, and profile the cadets whose careers were launched under this new paradigm. Stay tuned for our next episode, where the ripple effects of one judge's courage become a movement you won't want to miss. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you rethink the power of quiet dignity, please like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video to amplify its impact, because justice begins with how we treat each other, even when no one else is watching.